What is the most unsettling declassified information available to us today? On January 3, 1961, a United States B-52 bomber went into a tailspin and broke up midair, accidentally dropping two Mark 39 hydrogen bombs over Goldsboro, North Carolina. One of the bombs worked exactly as intended. Its parachute deployed and its triggers activated, armed and ready to detonate on impact. 3 of the 4 safety switches failed. A single low-voltage switch prevented 4 megaton nuclear explosions. John F. Kennedy's brain was lost before it could be autopsied. I am gonna say that again. Assassinated President John F. Kennedy's brain was lost. I don't mean what was left at the scene. I mean they cut it out of his head, set it aside, and went, whoops. The US government did initial research into a gay bomb in the 1990. It was a bomb that compelled people to have compulsive homosexual sex. Would have been the perfect terror weapon to use on ISIS. They are not afraid to die, but they are afraid to smoke the bone. Anyone bring up Rosemary Kennedy yet? The Kennedys are one of the most beloved families in America, despite a lot of fucked up shit, and this is the most fucked up shit. We put an instrument inside, he said, as Dr. Watts cut. Dr. Freeman put questions to Rosemary. For example, he asked her to recite the Lord's Prayer or sing, God Bless America, or count backwards. We made an estimate on how far to cut based on how she responded. When she began to become incoherent, they stopped. This chilled me to my core. I can't fathom anyone ever accepting lobotomies as a legitimate medical practice in any capacity. Fuck. The CIA's Family Jewels. It's a collection of fucked up shit the CIA did during the Cold War. Highlights include sexually assaulting prisoners to make them more likely to fail a lie detector test and the various wiretaps and standing orders to read all mail to and from Russia. The linked document has a table of contents. Operation Northwoods. US planned to have faked attacks on US just so they would have an excuse to overthrow Castro in Cuba. The Department of Health and Human Services practiced female sterilization on Native American women all the way through the 1970. Kinda sobering knowing that we were using tax dollars to suppress indigenous birth rates less than 50 years ago. Same in Canada. Many Métis women were sterilized as well and usually were not told about it. My aunt's cousin went in to have her tonsils out, sterilized while at it. Didn't find out till an adult and couldn't have kids. Human experimentation conducted by multiple governments. The Japanese famously conducted human experimentation research on the Chinese and Koreans. The United States had doctors infect minorities with incurable diseases and STDs to see how the disease progressed. They were used to test treatments and to understand infection rates. You should include the name of the most well-known site conducting that research, Unit 731 for those wondering. They performed vivisections, forced people to infect each other and children with STDs, namely syphilis, freeze people's limbs solid and record the damage and results, and perform a battery of other brutal tests. On one occasion, a child was repeatedly hit in the head with a hammer to study effects of repeated cranial trauma. There are reports of scientists raping captives because they were bored or had time to waste before their experiments. There were many pregnancies carried full term within the facilities. These children born in captivity were also experimented on and sometimes born with syphilis. Researchers and guards would call women infected with syphilis gem-filled buns. Nixon ordered massive bombings of Cambodia by B-52 bombers, which resulted in the deaths of approximately 150,000 people. On this list, you will find such things as, most of what I have typed below took place after 1950, all were on us citizens, people in the US without consent. New York University professor deliberately infecting disabled children with hepatitis. Tuskegee syphilis experiment, sponsored by the US Public Health Service. Infected 400 poor black males with syphilis under the guise of studying progression of diseases. The study ran for 40 years until 1972. San Quentin Prison, a doctor removing executed prisoners' testicles and implanting them into living prisoners. Subsequently, he would implant rem, goat, and boar testicles. Louisiana State Board of Health feeding Negro prisoners nothing but molasses for 5 weeks. At Sloan Kettering Institute, 300 healthy women were injected with cancer cells without their knowledge, and researchers said they knew it might give them cancer. Dow Chemical, the US Army, and Johnson & Johnson injecting dioxin into 70 prisoners and leaving them untreated to see the effects of dioxin, found in Agent Orange, on human skin. Project Bluebird, which was the CIA dosing 7,000 military members with LSD without their knowledge in the pursuit of a truth serum, also used for PCP, mescaline and heroin. The US Dept of Defense sponsored a pro tennis player being injected with mescaline and covering up his resulting death for 23 years. Project MKUltra, which could have a whole post in itself. The CIA was looking at anti-mind control and brainwashing techniques. Part of this project was to depattern and infantize individuals, putting patients into drug-induced comas for 80 days and then shocking them for months. After, they were forced to listen to specific messages for up to 20 hours a day for weeks. Many of these patients were sexually abused as well. The US Army paid for 320 inmates at Holmesburg Prison to be given mind-altering drugs in order to see what levels of drugs would be needed to destabilize 50% of a population. The US Navy sponsored a Harvard biochemist to inject 60 for mess prisoners with cow's blood. In the late 1800s in France, Jewish artillery officer Alfred Dreyfus was wrongfully convicted of treason based on false government documents and sentenced to life in prison. In the 1950 to 70, the CIA paid a number of well-known domestic and foreign journalists to publish CIA propaganda. George W. Bush grandfather and a bunch of other rich folks tried to turn the US into a fascist state with a military coup. They were found out, and none were prosecuted. Project Pluto, basically it was a missile powered by a nuclear reactor driving a ramjet engine. It would carry a payload of several nuclear warheads, and after it dropped all the nukes it would then spend months flying over areas at supersonic speeds powered by the reactor. It would fly so low and fast that it would create shockwave that could level buildings, and the jet exhaust would be highly radioactive. It was essentially a true doomsday device and very seriously looked into by the US, and what's terrifying is that it's declassified now, meaning even more insane stuff probably exists as black projects. Operation Condor. At least 60,000 deaths and who knows how many disappeared all over Latin America. When the US government threw the CIA-backed right-wing dictatorships to counter Soviet influence and destroy socialist governments all over the continent. Phoenix Program, CIA and Special Ops death squads in Vietnam. They absolutely will not mention this in your high school or college classes. The problem was, how do you find the people on the blacklist? It's not like you had their address and telephone number. The normal procedure would be to go into a village and just grab someone and say, "Where is Nguyen so and so?" Half the time the people were so afraid they would not say anything. Then a Phoenix team would take the informant, put a sandbag over his head, poke out a hole so he could see, put a wire around his neck like a long leash, and walk him through the village and say, "When we go by Nguyen's house, scratch your head." Then that night Phoenix would come back, knock on the door, and say, "April Fool, motherfucker." Whoever answered the door would get wasted. As far as they were concerned, whoever answered was a communist, including family members. Sometimes they would come back to camp with ears to prove that they killed people. The second in charge of the FBI sent a letter to Martin Luther King, trying to convince him to commit suicide in 34 days. The specifics of 34 is what I find most creepy. Why that number? They took recordings of his affairs and put them onto a tape and was going to get him to kill himself. The good that MLK did, and the fact that his cause is and was so just, make me really fear what is being done with the intel we have these days. I like the declassified Soviet papers that reveal Stalin's unshakable trust in Hitler, even as Russian intelligence informed Stalin that Hitler had broken the non-aggression pact and was invading the Soviet Union. Stalin refused to believe it, and instead punished the intelligence officers who tried to warn him. After the Soviet Union fell apart, declassified Soviet documents, it came out that FBI agent Robert Hansen had been a spy for the Soviets for decades. No one at the FBI knew until the Soviet documents were opened up. The FBI didn't polygraph people who were already cleared back then. Genius move on their part. This guy got a number of US agents killed. This will probably get buried, but when I was in college, I took an American foreign policy class which covered the 20th century. The professor was amazing and really blew my mind several times. One of the things we studied that had a huge impact on my naive mind was Operation Northwoods. This was a proposed CIA operation in which anti-Castro Cubans would shoot up parts of downtown Miami, conduct bombings, and other terrorist acts so that the United States could declare war on Cuba and take Fidel Castro out. Thankfully, JFK thought the operation crazy and refused to give it the green light. This was 2003, 2004, and 11 of September was still in the forefront of everyone's minds. Needless to say, a lot of us were speechless after reading the declassified files. Operation Northwoods involved flying remote-controlled passenger planes into buildings and blaming it on Cuba. The plans claimed that the remote control was feasible. The attacks would be used to justify an invasion of Cuba. This one is the most unsettling to me, because it sounds like an alternate reality version of 11 September, and the plans prove that remote controlling of passenger planes is not only possible, but was possible in the 1960s. Links to the documents can be found in the comments.